Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Kap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to Season 4, Episode 49 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 14 and the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Kap. Nick, we're recording this episode. It is Wednesday night. I'm going to drop it on Thursday morning. So it's our second episode heading into Week 14, or all boom and all bust teams. And it's crunch time for a lot of people that need that win to get into the playoffs, or even to get a bye, or anything along those lines. And hopefully you're in the mix this weekend and have something to root for regarding your fantasy football teams.
For sure. It's win or go home week. It's time to put up or shut up. Time to make that last chance to get in those playoffs. And that's what Nick and I are here for.
That's what we are here for. If you're a first-time viewer or listener, thank you for joining the show. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. It's our Friday or Thursday show, but I guess we're dropping on a Thursday. And we give you our all boom and all bust teams to get you ready for the weekend. You can find this show on YouTube and all audio streaming platforms, and you can connect with us on all social media platforms. So like I said, all boom and all bust teams, and here's how it works. If you are a first-time viewer or listener, thank you for joining. I also forgot to mention, we will have our 8:30 a.m. live show this Sunday on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, as we always do, to answer all of your fantasy football questions. Make sure to join us for that. All boom teams and all bust teams. So here's how it works. With the all boom and all bust teams, Nick gets priority over one team. I get priority over another team. I know for a fact that we only had one overlapping player this week, which is great. So we have 7 different boom players and 7 different bust players for you guys. So for the all boom team, it's a player that we think is going to boom, that is probably top 5 outside of the top 5 of their position, maybe a flex player, something like that. You're not going to see Saquon Barkley. You're not going to see Jamar Chase. They're just not going to be on the all boom team. So let's start things off, Nick, with quarterbacks. Who is your all boom quarterback for Week 14?
So, Nick, it is win or go home week. And for that, we want someone we can trust, someone that we think can be safe. We don't want to play anyone that's a risk that could lose us the week, which is why I am nominating Will Levis for the all boom team this week. One of the probably the biggest risk. But with 6 quarterbacks on bye, big bye week in Week 14, you're going to have to play some guys you don't want. You're probably picking up somebody off the waivers. If you had one of those young stars like Jaden Daniels. Well, I'm here to tell you, I think Will Levis has a very good opportunity this week going up against the Jaguars, who allow the second most points to the quarterback position. In the last 4 games, he has 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, averaging 240 yards per game. He's got 15-plus points per game in each of those games. The receivers have been very solid. We've seen Tyler Boyd have good games. We know about the Nick Westbrook-Ikine hot streak on the touchdowns. And Calvin Ridley gets that revenge game. All this combination, take out the name, look at the production, look at the opportunity. I think Will Levis could break that 20 mark for the first time in this 4-game stretch and give you a really solid game to go into to get you into the playoffs.
So I'm going to nominate a quarterback who also does have a little bit of a risk to him, but throughout the season, he's actually been pretty good. And that's going to be Sam Darnold, the guy who's appeared on either of these teams pretty much on an on-off weekly basis. Facing the Falcons, who allow the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, an average of 18.8 per game. 6 quarterbacks that have faced the Falcons this season have scored 17-plus fantasy points, all since Week 7. Sam Darnold has been pretty good. He's the quarterback 8 on the season and has 19-plus fantasy points in each of his last 3 games. I see no reason really why you can't trust him when you have all these numbers and the scenario to back him up. The only reason why you wouldn't trust him is because he's Sam Darnold, but he might have broken that mold at this point. If you don't trust him by Week 13 or 14, you're not going to trust him throughout your playoffs. So this is the time to figure out how much you do trust Sam Darnold. All right, going to the running backs. Who do you have as your first running back boom of the week?
First, I'm going with Rachaad White going up against the Raiders, a team that's kind of middle of the pack against the running backs, but the Bucs running backs have been cooking for this entire season. It's been the second best 1-2 combo right behind the Lions all year. Since the bye week, Bucky Irving has 100% lapped him, but he did get a little dinged up last week. Rachaad White saw 2 of his lowest target games over the last 2 weeks, but I think that's going to turn the tide. I think it'll be a lot more consistent, a lot more upside as the game goes on. And I think that Baker Mayfield's been cooking. I think this offense has been cooking. They played a ton of shootouts against teams like this that are middle of the pack. or the lower middle of the pack. So I expect this to be a very high-scoring game. And, of course, the running back position always benefits from that.
My first running back I'm going to nominate is Mr. Breakaway Speed, Tony Pollard, a guy that I told you to trade for both this Week 14 matchup and the rest of your fantasy football playoffs. Although he hasn't produced lately, he does have a phenomenal matchup going up against the Jaguars, who allow the second most fantasy points to running backs, an average of 25.6 per game. 11 backs this season that they face, again, 11 out of, 12 or 13, have scored 15 plus fantasy points. Tony Pollard has had 7 games with double-digit carries, over 10 carries, and in 6 of those, he has 15-plus fantasy points. So as long as he gets the volume, I think the game script will be good against a bad Jags team. As long as he gets the volume, Tony Pollard will probably end up having a top 10 week on your fantasy football roster. Running back 2, who do you have?
I'm going with DeAndre Swift, a guy that I've only put on the all-bust team this season, but a guy that we're going to look to turn the tide now. No Eberflus. The last 2 games without Shane Waldron over there. DeAndre Swift has gotten a lot more targets in those 2 games. The Bears have ramped up the passing volume, and DeAndre Swift's snap share has gone up a tiny bit and Roschon Johnson really is not getting that goal line work that he was getting from those 2 guys. So I'm going to expect the Bears to get a little bit of an uptick. The coaching swing, usually when a coach is fired, you see some of those players perform a little bit better. The team just I don't understand it, but it's a trend in the NFL. I think the Caleb and that ramped up passing volume is going to benefit Swift in those PPR formats. And I think the upside for a touchdown with Roschon not getting those touches and getting injured last week is definitely a lot higher than it was in games past.
I'm going to go with Chase Brown, another guy who I said could potentially end up being a league winner, and he's proven that over the last few weeks. First off, he's facing the Dallas Cowboys, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to running backs, an average of 23.2 points per game. The Cowboys have also allowed 7 backs to score 18 plus fantasy points this season. And as for Chase Brown, he has 19 plus fantasy points in each of his last 4 games after Zach Moss went out with a season-ending injury. Like I said, potential league winner. He's going to have some other good matchups down the stretch. Should be locked and loaded into your lineups going forward. And he'll probably appear on these teams, but really should be locked and loaded going forward every single week. Wide receiver 1, who do you have?
I'm going with T. Higgins. And Nick, I have a question for you, something I have not done in a few weeks.
I do like questions.
We're going to do it. So, Nick, where do you think T. Higgins ranks in points per game at the wide receiver position this season?
18.
Number 3 on the entire year. He has missed a ton of time due to injuries. He's averaging 18.4 points per game. He's only behind Jamar Chase and Nico Collins. But he has been very, very good in those 7 games that he has played. He's got 5 touchdowns in the span. He's averaging about 10 targets per game. And now he goes up against the fraud Cowboys defense. I don't know if you saw the Jamar Chase quote that Trayvon Diggs still haunts him, which is kind of crazy for him to say. But he's been haunted by Trayvon Diggs. Though? From the last time that they faced. Jamar Chase had his worst game of his career in his eyes against Trayvon. So anyways, I think T. Higgins is going to absolutely cook here. I think that this offense for the Bengals has been explosive. We watched Nick mention Chase Brown. The running back has been very solid. And Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, both of them have been great this year when they've been out on the field. I think T. Higgins is going to explode. And if he stays healthy down this playoff stretch, I'm hoping he can keep that 18 points per game target and really be a league winner.
My first receiver here, and a lot of these are just opportunities at this point. I'm going to go with Drake London. I know he's kind of disappointed as of late, had some really tough cornerback matchups, but now he benefits from the best matchup of his season, probably going up against the Minnesota Vikings, who allow the most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 32.9. London's also your wide receiver 6 on the season with an average of 15.4 points per game. So I would definitely pick on this Vikings defense a little bit in a pretty big matchup between the Falcons and the Vikings this week.
Yep.
A lot of fantasy points should be scored in this one.
Kirk Cousins revenge game too.
It is a Kirk Cousins revenge game. All right. Your second wide receiver. Who do you have?
I'm going with Giacobbe Myers. Giacobbe Myers has been really solid this year, but I don't think we've really acknowledged how great he's been since the Devontae trade. Since Devontae got injured and it's really become his team, he did miss a couple games, but here is his scoring in those games. 21, 10, 13, 17, 19, 9, 22, and 16. A lot of these coming up against tough matchups. 2 games against Kansas City, where he averaged 16 points per game, up against Patrick Surtain, where he scored an average of 16 or 17 points per game. The target share in these games, 9, 10, 9, 7, 11, 6, 15, and 11 the last 2 weeks. Now he goes up against Tampa Bay. I already mentioned it earlier in the Rachaad White take. I think this is going to be a super high-scoring game, and that's just going to benefit the biggest target guy on this team. Him and Brock Bowers should both explode, but Brock Bowers is not eligible for this team anymore. Well, we'll find out if Nick put him, but I don't.
I did not. My second wide receiver I have here is George Pickens, who's always on one of these teams. But I don't think he'll be on the bust teams anymore throughout the season because of how good he's been with Russell Wilson. He's a wide receiver 18 on the season, has double-digit fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games, 16+ in 4 of those 6 games. As for his matchup this week, facing those Cleveland Browns, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 31.1. They just allowed like 40 points on Monday Night Football or something crazy like that. They've also allowed 14 touchdowns to wide receivers. That's over a touchdown a game. Good opportunity for Pickens, who also has a ridiculous first read rate from Russell Wilson at this point. He really takes the top off the defense and takes the Steelers from an average grinded out offense into a more dynamic offense. So I'd keep Pickens locked and loaded in your lineups. Tight end, who do you have?
I'm going with David Njoku, a guy from the same exact game. He has been very, very solid on the target share front, and it's been solid. The last few games, he has 7, 14, 7, 7, 9, 5, and 17 last week. Very high target share for the guy. But it's been complimenting to Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston has been Jameis Winston this year, and we know that means ups and downs, but his skill position players benefit from it. Here is his passing volume since he became the starting quarterback: 41, 46, 46, 27, 58. He is passing at an absurdly high volume, and you're always going to have to play the tight end that's going to get that kind of target share with that kind of workload from the quarterback.
My tight end, I'm going to go with Cade Otton, who another one. I guess my theme here is that players that haven't produced in the last few weeks, but now will produce. Facing the Raiders, who allowed the 3rd most fantasy points, 2 tight ends, an average of 13.3. They've also allowed 8 tight ends to score 9+ fantasy points against them. So good opportunity for Otton. It's a bye week with like 6 different, teams on bye, a couple big tight ends, Hunter Henry, Mark Andrews. Can't think of anybody else off the top of my head, but it's probably a week where you can't bench Cade Otton. So you can have some confidence starting him in your lineups. Your flex, who do you have?
I'm going with Khalil Shakir. The 5 games before this past week with the snow game, he was on a bit of a hot streak, very consistent: 14, 20, 11, 12, and 15. 3 of those games were against teams that were top 5 against the wide receiver position. Now he goes up against the Rams, who are the easiest matchup he's had since week 4. I think it's time to comfortably start him. I'm not worried about Amari Cooper. Obviously, Coleman's missed some time, and I think Khalil Shakir is still proving to be the wide receiver 1 over here.
I'm going to go with Jordan Addison facing off against those Falcons, who allow the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 30.2. Pair him up with Sam Darnold in my all-boom team. Addison also has 15+ fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 matchups. So again, does have a pretty sturdy connection with Sam Darnold. So I think a lot of points will be scored in this game, as I've stated a couple times.
Yeah.
Going now to the all-bust team, I'm pretty sure that Nick had one of the same guys as me and did have to change on the all-bust team, but that was the only one that either of us have known on either of these teams. So, Nick, who's your quarterback for the all-bust team for week 14?
I'm going with Patrick Mahomes. And, I love saying that I'm starting Will Levis and I'm not starting Patrick Mahomes. It's a kind of crazy take. But listen, Patrick Mahomes played against this Chargers defense in week 4. He had his worst game of the year with 14 points. It's kind of crazy. He's been very, very consistently over 14. Just hasn't really exploded like you wanted him to for how early you drafted him. But nevertheless, the Chargers allowed the least points per game in the NFL. I know a lot of people are always going to assume Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, these two should have a high-scoring game because both of them are elite quarterbacks. But Jim Harbaugh has kept all these games close. He's kept them all low-scoring except that Bengals game. So I'm going to expect that streak to continue. I'm going to say history repeats itself, and Patrick Mahomes does not have a superstar game. Maybe he'll always have the safe floor of being Patrick Mahomes, but he has not really exploded this year, and I think he's going to be closer to that 14 than he will be 20.
I'm going to go with Brock Purdy. The 49ers are falling apart, and it's just like, I'm the Grinch. You know when the Grinch just goes, I am the Grinch here. I love seeing the 49ers fall apart. It brings a big smile to my face. There's a little Easter egg for Nick over there. The Bears, Brock Purdy's facing the Bears, and I love picking on the Bears when it comes to how good their defense is, I should say, not picking on them, giving them props. The Bears allow the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, an average of 13.5. They allow the third fewest touchdown passes throughout the season, and only four quarterbacks have scored 16 plus fantasy points against the Bears. They also just fired Matt Eberflus. They were on a mini bye, about 10 days rest to prepare for the 49ers. This might be a Bears win, Nick. I don't know. Firing the coach, they're going to be fired up. This might be a big Bears win this weekend, so we'll see.
I like it.
All right, first running back, who do you have?
I'm going with James Cook. You're going to see the theme, I guess, with all bus team is history repeats itself. Well, 2 years ago, he had the same exact matchup against your Seattle Seahawks, and he was not good. He had 7 rushing attempts. He had 5 catches, which was a season high, and that was off a bye week. I'm going to say we temper the expectations for James Conner once again. And even though Seattle was fun to pick up on running backs for the last few years, they've really kind of heated up over the last few weeks, and they've been stifling a few of those top backs. So we're going to stay away from this matchup.
I am going to go with the Chargers running backs, whether it's Gus Edwards or Kamani Vidal. I'll try to bench both of them. I'm saying this as one of them is actually in my dynasty lineup in the moment with Jonathan Taylor on bye. But my other option is Kareem Hunt. So the Chiefs allow the fewest fantasy points, 2 running backs, an average of 13.1. I believe every running back that has faced the Chiefs this season has been on the old bust team. They've had great performances against both Derrick Henry and some of the other really top backs that they faced, James Cook, a couple other backs they faced. And for the Chargers running backs, neither of them looked good last week. They both didn't get a ton of carries, and they both had under double digits. So I'm worried about the committee. I'm worried about the talent, and I'm worried about the defense. So I would keep them on the bench this week if you can. Your second running back, who do you have?
I am going with another guy that winds up on one of these lists all the time. It is Najee Harris. Again, history repeats itself. 2 weeks ago, had this matchup, was his worst game of the season at 7.4. Only averaged 2.5 yards per attempt and 2 targets. So we're just going to keep it short and simple and say, Najee, this has been a kryptonite matchup for you in this division rivalry, and we're going to try and stay away from you if we can in this week.
Next up, I have Chuba Hubbard, and I think he was on this team last week, the week before on my side. He's facing the Eagles, who allow the 4th fewest fantasy points, 2 running backs, an average of 15.7. Chuba Hubbard, not only is it a bad defensive matchup, but he now has Jonathan Brooks breathing down his neck a little bit. He carried the ball last week for 15 carries in a positive matchup against the Bucs, but only ended up at about 2.3 fantasy points. Jonathan Brooks, however, carried the ball 9 times. They're going to start integrating the rookie a little bit more, I think. It'll be a 2-headed monster situation. So I think another one where if you can keep Chuba Hubbard on the bench, I would, if possible. But again, 6 bye weeks. Derrick Henry's on bye. Jonathan Taylor. I think Derrick Henry's on bye. Is he?
Yep.
No, he is. Yeah, so it's Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Joe Mixon, all on bye. Might be tough too, but this is a temper expectations matchup for sure. First wide receiver, who do you have?
I'm going with Malik Neighbors. Neighbors has been the talk of the rookie class at the wide receiver position after the first few weeks, but he has not been very solid ever since. He's got the safe floor. He's had 7+ targets in every single game, super high ceiling against New Orleans, and I'm sure this is a matchup a lot of people are looking to take advantage of, and I'm not saying bench Malik Neighbors with that workload, but what I am telling you to do is temper your expectations. Since week 7, all of his games, he has finished between 8 points and less than 15 points. He has not finished within the top 24 receivers in a single week this in that time span. We know we all reprojected him to be a top 5 receiver rest of the season after those first 4 games, maybe even after the first game or 2. But that's just not the case. The quarterback play has been lackluster. There's been 3 different starting quarterbacks over the last 4 games, and it's just not been very solid for fantasy. So I'm going to say leave him in the lineup because you know he's going to have a good matchup and he should have a safe floor. But what I'm telling you not to do is expect that 30-point bomb that's going to win you the week.
I'm going to go with Mr. Deebo Samuel. I think Nick had him in the old bust team last week or the week before, and he has been busting. He's under 10 fantasy points in each of his last 3 matchups and now faces the Bears defense, who allow the 4th fewest fantasy points, 2 wide receivers, an average of 22.8. He's in my dynasty lineup as well. I'm very, very concerned about my dynasty team this week that needs a win, and I'm very upset about that. But it's going to be a tough week for Deebo. I'm considering benching him for Juwan Jennings, but his matchup's not any better because he's also facing the Bears. So, I would keep Deebo. Again, temper expectations for a guy that really has not exceeded expectations in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
All right. Your second wide receiver.
Well, the one that I wanted was Deebo Samuel, and my pivot was to his partner in crime, Juwan Jennings. Now,
Uh-oh.
Debo obviously has been much worse over the last few games, but Jawan Jennings has not been much better either over the last 2 games against teams that are top 5 against the wide receiver position. He scored under 10 in both of those. And it's not because he's seen the cornerback 2. It's because he's been shadowed by the cornerback 1 in each of the last 2 games. He has played the Brandon Ayuk role, which has always demanded the number 1 cornerback because Debo goes into motion so much. You can expect even more of that with CMC and Jordan Mason out. So I am definitely concerned that Jalen Johnson is going to be the cover guy on that. And that just means it's going to be a very bad week for a guy that has not played great in back-to-back games. We also know Brock Purdy is still dealing with that shoulder injury. So that does not make me any more comfortable to start him against one of the league's top corners.
I'm benching a Jet. I can't go a show without talking about the Jets. Sorry, Nick. But Garrett Wilson has been booty as of late. Under 10 fantasy points in each of his last 3 matchups, just like Deebo Samuel. And I don't understand this one because he's very, very talented. And maybe Rodgers is checked out. Maybe he's too worried about that Netflix show that's coming out, The Enigma. Anyway, tough matchup here for Garrett Wilson against the Dolphins. Will face Jalen Ramsey, allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 22.2. I do like the bust, the opposing receiver against the Dolphins last week. Jaden Reed exceeded my expectations, but he does play a lot from the slot. I don't see Garrett Wilson playing a lot of snaps from the slot. So I think it's going to be a tough one for Garrett Wilson and the Jets, who offensively just are not clicking at the moment. So.
To aid your case, it's really been Devontae as the number 1 target ever since the trade. He's out targeted.
But I feel like the first 2 or 3 weeks it was Garrett Wilson. Am I wrong on that? I feel like Garrett.
No, it was. It just transferred to the Devontae show the last few weeks. You can take a look at his target share.
Well, they're also not. They're just not scoring a lot of points. They're not.
Devontae's been solid. Devontae has been really solid for fantasy. I pivoted off of DK for him last week, and it won me the week, thankfully. But
it's smart.
Devontae's been solid. He hasn't been Devontae Adams, but he's been a solid fantasy receiver.
And then for tight end, who do you have?
I'm going with Evan Engram. We just found out that Trevor Lawrence was placed on the IR, likely done for the year. So now he gets Mac Jones, which is never a good sign. Evan Engram over this season has only eclipsed 45 yards once in a single game. We know he has that boom bust upside. But again, if you're not getting to 45 yards, you really need 6-7 catches because we always look for double digits, or you need the touchdown. The Titans are a top 8 team against the tight end position, so I'm not going to trust him with Mac Jones and without Trevor Lawrence.
For my 10 end, I'm going to go with Tucker Kraft facing the Lions on Thursday Night Football. So if you're watching the show on, hopefully you're watching on Thursday, this is your Tucker Kraft Thursday Night Football talk. The Lions allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, an average of 5.2. Only 1 tight end has scored more than 9 points against the Lions this season. And when Tucker Kraft faced them in week 9, he only scored 7.6 fantasy points. I probably busted him that week, but I don't know. So, all right, your flex, who do you have?
I am going with Adam Thielen, a guy that I think last week got a lot of people excited because you got him off your waivers. He had like 8 catches and 10 targets and a touchdown or 2. Like, he had a crazy good week. Well, guess what? Adam Thielen is old. That man belongs in a home at this point. He might be the oldest receiver in football. He's definitely one of the oldest players in football. He might be the oldest receiver. I think it was a massive outlier. You look at the rest of his games this year. I know he missed a lot of time with injury. I do not think you can trust him in a win-or-go-home spot. If you see another double-digit target game this week and you're lucky enough to go to your playoffs, then maybe you could ride the hot hand, but I do not trust Adam Thielen.
All right, the last one I have here, and this is just a matchup-based one, it's Brian Thomas Jr. facing off the Titans, who allowed the 7th fewest points to wide receivers, an average of 23.9. Brian Thomas has been decent, depending on the quarterback play, depending on the matchup. I think he had back-to-back weeks of 15-plus fantasy points, so he's been solid the last few weeks, but I don't like the matchup against the Titans. I don't like the fact that Mac Jones is starting. Mac Jones didn't fumble, didn't throw an interception last week. He actually looked good, and I just can't see that trend continuing, and maybe that sounds bad, but I just can't. So that is why he is my last bust of the week. So that is our last show heading into week 14. If we talked about 14 different players here. 28 actually. 14 booms, 14 busts. If we did not talk about your player, though, Join our Sunday morning live show, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram to answer all of your fantasy football questions. Start, sit, pickups, anything that we can help you with, we will help you with. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you drop a like on the YouTube. We'd appreciate that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. We'd appreciate that as well. If you're listening on an audio streaming platform or would like to listen on an audio streaming platform, we're available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Anchor. Anywhere where you can find a podcast, you can find us, the Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. If you have any other questions, go to our social media, Twitter, Primetime FF Pod, and Instagram, Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you guys for the support. We'll talk to you guys on Sunday. Make sure to join that live, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram.